Hi everyone. So I'm here to tell you to all stop using JavaScript. Don't worry, it'll be fun. But first, who am I? So I'm Kilian. I've been building websites for over 20 years. I am part of the Electron governance team. If you're not familiar with Electron, it's a framework that uses web technologies to build desktop apps. So it combines Node and Chromium and lets you build things like Slack, VS Code, etc. I use that to build a browser called Polypane. It helps you with responsive design, accessibility, and like overall website quality. This talk isn't about that, but everything you see on this screen here is written in React. So I actually write a lot of JavaScript all day, every day. I love JavaScript a lot, but I also love CSS, and I even love HTML. And the reason I love all three of these technologies is something called the rule of least power. It's one of the core principles of the web, and it means that you should choose the least powerful language suitable for a given purpose. So on the web, this means preferring HTML over CSS and then CSS over JavaScript. Your JavaScript can fail to load. If your JavaScript has an error, it won't run. It takes extra resources to download. It takes extra resources to parse and execute. It can easily execute users using assistive technologies or keyboards even. And that is because JavaScript, as we've already discussed earlier today, JavaScript is imperative. You tell the browser how to do something. HTML and CSS, on the other hand, are declarative. And declarative is awesome, as we've learned. So what that means, in my words, is that rather than telling the browser what to do or how to do something, you tell the browser what to do. And the browser then takes that thing and it figures it out for you. It figures out how to do it performantly. It figures out how to do it accessibly. And you don't have to think about that. So that really is the foundation. And the good news is that browser makers and specification writers are listening to us. In the past few years, they have been porting a lot of functionality that used to require JavaScript over to CSS and over to HTML, embedding them in a language and letting you describe them in a declarative way. So that's what we'll be discussing today. But the reason this is important is that on the web, once you learn something, you never have to learn it again. Because that's the contract we have with the web. There's a sort of endless backwards compatibility. If you wrote a slider in JavaScript 10 years ago and you open that web page, that slider will still work. It might even be a little bit faster. So that means that once you've learned how to implement something in JavaScript, that becomes part of your toolbox. And you can use that over and over and over, and it will keep working. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's still the best way to do something. So the techniques that I'll be teaching you today are cool, and that's why I'm sharing them. But the overarching message that I want to share with you is just because you know something needs JavaScript, the next time you need to implement that, Google something, search, try and figure out if there's not a better and easier way to do the same thing. Because your websites will end up being more resilient, more accessible, and nicer to work with. So let's get started. It's a bit of a grab bag of features. So some are old, some are new, some are large, some are small. Some of these you might already know, and that's fine. There's going to be a lot of videos, because there used to be a lot of live demos, but you know, I can't type right now. With the live demos, there's always something that breaks, and that's part of the fun, I think. So in one of the videos, there's a bug, and it's your job to figure out which one. Just shout if you see it. let's start. So we'll start with custom switches. You know, the nice looking toggles that we want in all our apps because Apple invented them. Usually, when you look at something like this, you'll go, okay, so I need a couple of divs, an on-click handler, I need to store the state somewhere. Instead of doing that, let's build it with an ordinary checkbox input and use CSS to toggle its state. So we'll start with this. As you can see, we're just using a regular input inside a label with a type of checkbox. And that's all we need. And I think if I press play now, the video plays. Yes! Isn't that awesome? Click, click. But because we're using declarative HTML, the browser is already doing stuff for us. Because you saw that I clicked on the checkbox and it toggled, of course. But after that, I clicked on the text. And if we look very carefully here, over here, we don't see an on-click handler. But the browser knows that the input inside the label is associated with that label. So the browser provides an on-click handler for us. If you click anywhere in the label, the checkbox will toggle. So it's much easier, of course, to click anywhere on the text compared to that very small square. But that very small square doesn't look very nice. So let's add just a teeny tiny bit of CSS. Now, everything you see here isn't that important. It's just, you know, stuff to make the borders round and add some nice colors, except for that line all the way at the top, appearance none. And I see now that this selector has been cut off, but that's for the input itself. So on the web, form controls like input and images are something called replaced elements. And that means that when the browser renders your HTML, it leaves space for these elements to be filled in later. With an image, it's the image coming from another network resource. And with form controls, it's the operating system providing these form controls, these inputs, these buttons, these selects for you. That's, by the way, also why they're historically hard to style, but luckily that's a solved problem. And that's also why we're doing this here. But if you replace content, that means that you no longer can control what that content looks like. So things like pseudo elements, the before and after pseudo elements that are part of an element, they get replaced as well, which is why you can't do before and after on images or inputs. They're there, but you know, they get replaced, they're gone. With appearance none, we can tell the browser, you know, hold on, don't replace my element. I'm going to be styling this and I'm going to take care of how this should look. And that means that our before element is back. So what we can do now is we can use the input itself to provide the background, the track of the toggle or the switch. And then we can use the before element to draw that nice little border there, or a circle there, the thumb. And because it's still just an input, you know, clicking it to toggle the state still works. See, I clicked it and now the checkbox is checked. Trust me, it's checked. But we're not showing it to the user yet. So let's use the checked pseudo class. To make that change visible, we use the checked pseudo class. And this will match whenever the input would normally show that checkbox. So now as I click, the checked pseudo class will match and we get the green background and the thumb slides. So that's great, but we need to add one more thing, and that's taking care of accessibility. So while for people using a mouse, it's really easy to know what they're interacting with, because that's the thing under the mouse that they just clicked. If you use a keyboard, that's much harder, because you don't know where you're focusing. So what we'll do here is to add a focus style. And we'll use focus visible for that. So with the video, I click, and you see it toggles as normal. But now I move my mouse away and I use the space bar, and you see that this outline appears. Now, if you've designed or built websites for the past decade or so, you might remember outline as that ugly square black dotted line around things that you just want to get rid of, that you just want to do focus or outline is none on because it's very ugly. Well, as you can see, it looks pretty good now because outline in modern browsers follows the border radius. You can give it a thickness, you can give it a different color, and you can even offset it from the element. So you can do a lot to make this usable for keyboard users. And that's also why we're using focus visible. So focus will match whenever a user interacts with an element, whether that's with a keyboard or with a mouse. Focus visible only applies when the user interacts with an element with a keyboard or another assistive technology. So it's in place of the cursor that you can see. Does this mean we can do input focus outline none? Well, no, I would rather you didn't. Instead, I would want you to do outline color transparent. The result for all of us is the same. With outline none, you don't see the outline because it's not there. With outline color transparent, you don't see it because it's invisible. It's all the same. Until a user turns on a high contrast mode in Windows. About 1 in 25 people use high contrast mode on Windows. And what high contrast mode on Windows does is it replaces all the colors on a screen with a limited user-selected palette. So, for example, all the text gets the same color, everything gets the same background, everything gets the same link text. All your colors get replaced. And so outline color transparent suddenly becomes visible again to the users that benefit from that. So rather than outline none, use outline color transparent. And if you want to learn more about forced color mode, you can check an article at polypane.app/forced-colors. Now, that's a lot of words for a very small input type checkbox and a lot of CSS and a lot of things you need to think about. But just to show you how fast browsers are moving or how browsers are moving features from JavaScript to CSS and to HTML, Safari recently released this, where if you have an input with type checkbox, you can add a switch attribute to it, and Safari will then render for you this custom switch. It's completely stylable, so they added new elements or new pseudo elements, the thumb and the track, so you can style all of that individually. So that's also why I didn't spend too much time on all that CSS. Eventually, you'll just have to write input type checkbox switch. That is, if all the other browsers also agree and start implementing this. So, a lot of words for a checkbox. Let's do a couple of quick ones. Who's here heard of data list? So, excellent, thank you. So, data list is like browsers built in autosuggest library. So instead of importing React autosuggest, you can just add a data element or data list element to your page, which will be hidden by default, and then refer to it with a list attribute on any input. And now that input is sort of magically updated to having suggestions. So there are suggestions as you type. It will filter down the list for you. You can select from the list, but because it's an input, you can still type anything you want, so you don't lose functionality, and you can also click the drop-down to get the entire list of suggestions. So quite a lot of functionality for just listing the options that you have instead of importing some very large library. Now, for color pickers, instead of shipping a very large JavaScript color picker, with a nice canvas and a selection box, etc., you can also just type input type color, and that will actually do more because it's the browser that handles that. And because it's the browser that handles it, they give you the thing you want, But a browser can do more than a web page, because a browser has more rights. So what a browser can do is pick a color from anywhere on the screen and give that to you. That's not something you can do in your JavaScript, because that would be a massive security leak. But if it's the browser, it's okay. So you can actually provide more features to your users by doing less work. Isn't that great? Yes, yes, it's great. Okay, thanks. Let's move to something a little bit bigger again, in-page transitions. So when you move from one section of a page to another section of a page, usually that happens in an instant. And that can be annoying because you don't know how far down the page you've gone. Maybe you've missed stuff that would have been really cool. Wouldn't it be nicer if instead of that you sort of gently scroll down to the next part of the page? Well, in the past we would have used jQuery for that. Who here is old enough for jQuery? Don't lie. Okay, so jQuery, awesome. In just 7 lines you can implement this, where it finds all the links that go to the current page, and then when you click it, you find where it goes to, and you animate to it. 7 lines, perfect. But of course, jQuery isn't 7 lines. jQuery is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lines of JavaScript. You can forget all your jQuery knowledge, like in general, but for this as well, because we can do it in CSS with just a single line. With scroll behavior smooth, we tell the browser that whenever you navigate to a fragment identifier, an ID on your page, scroll to it smoothly. And what's nice about this is that, again, it's declarative. The browser will do the work for you. There is no loop running that scrolls the page like 20 pixels every 60 milliseconds. The browser figures out where it should go, how long it should take, how much CPU there's available, and that means that the browser will make sure that this is always smooth. It's not competing for your other JavaScript stuff. It's the browser making sure that it works. So the animation is always snappy. Now, this is CSS, but don't worry, it's available in JavaScript too. Any of the scrolling APIs, so scroll to, scroll by, scroll into view, etc., you can give it an option of behavior smooth, and then you also get smooth scrolling there without you needing to do any of the boring, mathy calculation stuff. So that still saves you a lot of JavaScript, even if you use JavaScript. Hooray! Let's, however, take accessibility into account. Because while for most people, it's the jumping from one part of the page to another part of the page that's annoying, for people with vestibular disorders, it's the movement that causes them discomfort. So we want to prevent that for our users. It's not a great experience if our website makes a user nauseous. They're not going to buy anything if they're nauseous. So what we want to do is make the accessible experience the default experience. And that means that we can use prefers reduced motion, which is a media query that will toggle depending on user settings on their device. It can be either reduce when people don't want motion, or no preference when they don't mind motion. So what we're going to do is we're only going to turn smooth scrolling on when the user doesn't mind motion. So when there's prefers reduced motion, no preference, then we add smooth scrolling. That way we cater to everyone. Smooth. We now have a native smooth scrolling for the people that want that, and no smooth scrolling for the people that don't, and we're not shipping any JavaScript. It's a great start, but in real life, we usually need to do a little bit more. So instead of smooth scrolling to a part of the page, what if we also have a fixed header that we need to take into account? Rather than figuring out how high the header is and then subtracting that from how far we scroll, and we can use scroll margin. So scroll margin and scroll padding are CSS properties that tell you how much margin or padding to add to an element, but only when it's being scrolled to. So if I click to target now, let me try it again. There we go. Yes. You can see that it scrolled to my middle title. But now if I scroll back up, which doesn't have a scroll margin, it ends up behind the header and I still have to scroll it down. So that's not a great experience. We can solve that with scroll margin. And what if we want to scroll somewhere, but then the thing we're scrolling to, we want to give it like some extra prominence. Of course, we could add like a class with JavaScript, like onClick, add the class to the target, blah, blah, blah. But we can also use the target pseudo class, which will match the element we just linked to and add our CSS animation there. Again, declaratively. So now we've built a way to smoothly scroll to a specific section, highlight it, and keep room for any of the fixed headers that we might have. All without JavaScript. Pretty nice. Now, in the previous couple of demos, you saw a header that was fixed. But position fixed is pretty hard to work with because it takes the element out of the flow. So no other part of the page can interact with it anymore. But what if you have an element that you want to keep in view some part of the time, but not all of the time? Well, that's what position sticky can do. So with position sticky, an element will be attached to its parent, like a regular position relative, until it hits a boundary that you can set with top, left, bottom, and right. When it hits that boundary, it will turn into a fixed element until it can no longer stick to that boundary, for example, because the parent element scrolled away again. So this would be perfect, for example, any in-view library that you would use. In the future, we might also get a stuck pseudo class, so you can do stuff when it's stuck and then do other stuff when it's unstuck. We're not there yet, but we're pretty far already. So let's talk about another standard JavaScript thing, carousels, or in CSS land, scroll snap APIs. So with scroll snap, we can create sliders where the contents snap to the edges of their parent. But while scrolling, it's just a normal scroller. So there's a one-to-one relationship between me scrolling and the element scrolling. There's no JavaScript layer between that. But when you stop scrolling, the browser will snap the child element to the parent for you. So the way to do this is on the parent, you set a scroll snap type, which is either X for horizontal or Y for vertical. And then you tell it when it should snap. It's either mandatory, which means it will always snap, or proximity. And then it will snap only when it's close enough to the edge. What's the edge? Well, that's what you define on the child elements. So an edge is either the start, the end, or the center. The start is the side where the text starts. So that means that if you have a multilingual website, start in English would be on the left side, but in an Arabic side, start is on the right side. So that way you can even take that into account without needing any switches. So this is pretty nice, but again, because it's the browser, we can also do this, scroll snap align center. And now as this video plays, I want you to search within yourself. Realize that all of these squares have different sizes and they snap to the center of this element. Please take a moment to figure out the math you would need to write to do that in CSS. Thank you. So There's way more cool stuff you can do with the scroll snap APIs that I don't have time to get into, but this talk by Adam Argyle shows a lot of crazy stuff. But we're just going to move on to accordions and modals, because those things we also solve with JavaScript way too many times. So having an accordion on your page can really help make the design more clean, because you can hide stuff away behind some titles and only expand them when the user wants that. Well, in HTML, we can use the details and the summary element for that. By default, everything inside the details element is hidden, except for the summary element. And then when you click the summary element, all the other info is shown. Now, this is great, but of course, if you have a bunch of them, your designer probably wants to have the first one open, just so that people know that they can click it and there's stuff there and it's aesthetically pleasing. And you as a developer say, well, sure. You just add the open attribute and now the details are open. Now, if any of you write React, you might look at this and go, well, great, now it's just open. There's an open prop and it's just going to be open forever. Great job, Kilian. But don't worry, because this is not a prop. This is an attribute. And specifically, it's a live attribute. So you can set it in your HTML, but as the user interacts with your page, that attribute will update itself. So if I close it, the open attribute is gone. And if I open it again, the open attribute is added by the browser without you needing to do any work. And that's great, but let's go back to the designer, because they'll look at that triangle and they'll go, that's not a great triangle. And then you as a developer say, well, sure. We'll use the marker element and we'll style it the way we want to. So the marker element is that little triangle and we can do stuff with it. We can replace it with our own content, we can give it a background image, and we can even use that open live attribute to switch it out with something else when the details are open. So there's quite a lot of styling we can do here. Now, lastly, even though a summary is clickable, like a button or a link, it doesn't look clickable like a button, and it doesn't have a different cursor or an underline like a link. So what I want you to do is, if you do something like this, make sure that the user knows that your summary is clickable. It doesn't really matter what you do, just do something to make the user aware that this thing is clickable. Moving on to the dialog element. So for this one, I am going to cheat a little because it does need a little bit of JavaScript. You got me. But the dialog element in HTML is like a better prompt or a better alert. It implements a modal dialog for you, and it takes care of all the things that matter, like keeping the focus inside of it, showing a backdrop, making sure that the rest of the page doesn't interfere with it. It prevents Z-index issues, and it also handles closing the elements. But unlike alert, confirm, and prompt, it's part of your page. It's just HTML, and that means it's not JavaScript main thread blocking code. If you open a dialog, your JavaScript will run just fine, because again, it's just an HTML element. So this is what a dialog looks like, because by default a dialog isn't visible. Inside the dialog, we're adding a form, and I'll explain why in the next slide. This form has a method of dialog, not a method of post. So this is a new thing. To show this modal, we need to call showModal on the dialog. This is a JavaScript or DOM API that you can call, and then the modal is shown. Ta-da! And that's also where the form comes in, because as you saw, it was really quick, sorry about that. Again. So as you see, there is no UI that the browser provides to get rid of that modal dialog again. It's on you to provide that UI. And that's where we can use the form. Because if you have a form with a method of dialog, when you submit that form, it's a signal for the browser to close the dialog again. And you can do that with any button. So another neat thing about the dialog is that it's added to something called the top layer. And the top layer is a new concept in browsers, and it's essentially a layer that sits between the page and you. And you don't get to do stuff on the top layer. You can only submit elements to the top layer. And that means that you never have to fight the chat widget button again with your modal dialogs. Because no matter how high the Z index on that chat button widget is, the top layer will always win. So that's how you implement a confirmation dialog. We'll do it again. Play. You say, here's a big error, press OK. But we can also give options, because we can add more buttons to the form and give each button a value. So here, you can imagine that this is like a do you want to save dialog, where it's like save or cancel or prevent or dismiss. And then in your JavaScript, you can figure out the return value with dialog.returnValue. Now, lastly, I mentioned the backdrop, and you can style this dialog however you want, with rounded corners, drop shadows, etc. But you can also style the layer between the dialog and the rest of the page, and that's called the backdrop. So the browser will make sure that the backdrop always sits between you and the rest of the page. But you can add, for example, a background or some blur to it, depending on how much emphasis you want to put on this particular dialog. So the backdrop automatically sizes. You don't have to worry about scrolling or fixed positions or whatever. It will always sit on top of the rest of the page. Now, there's a neat new thing, like very new. It's not in Firefox yet, and that's the starting style add rule. The starting style add rule lets you animate things as they get added to the DOM. So you get a pretty animation with just a few lines of CSS. So the way that works is you define your style as you want it to end up. And then with starting style, you say, well, actually start from this style, and then you can animate to your normal style. And that means you can animate the dialog as you add it to the top layer. It's pretty neat. So you've probably already heard of container queries, but I wanted to mention it anyway because it has so much potential. Container queries are like media queries, except instead of looking at the entire browser, they can look at any parent element. And for example, here I have 2 card containers. They are small and wide, and depending on that, I can switch my layout, my flex direction. You can do much, much more than this, but the point here is that if you have a card component or any other component, and that has many variants because it needs to live in the main page, it needs to live in the sidebar, it needs to live somewhere else where there's a bunch of different styles, you can get rid of all of those variants and instead look at where they are on the page and how much space they have available, and style them purely using CSS. And that way there's never a mismatch between where your component is and the variant you've chosen. So you end up with a much more resilient design. Similarly, the has selector can replace a ton of JavaScript because it allows us for the first time to style elements based on the state of elements anywhere else on your page. It's often called the parent selector because it allows you to style the parent based on the children inside of it, which was the big issue. But you can, with has, you can also style elements based on a completely different part of your DOM. For example, and there are many cool examples, and this is just a really small, simple one. What if you have a form, as you do, with a bunch of options, and one of them is other? And when someone selects other, you want to show an input, and then the person can write their answer into that input. With has, it's a single additional line. So as I select other, we now have other checked, remember, from our checkbox that evaluates to true. So the form has other checked, and then we can style the other text input to display. It's as simple as that. 0 listeners, no click handlers, just easy to follow CSS, and no JavaScript needed. So all the things I mentioned up till now, except starting style, are available in all browsers today. You can use them today. But I also wanted to give a quick overview of some of the stuff that's coming up that's also going to replace a bunch of JavaScript. Each of these could be their own presentation, so I'm not going to do any of them justice, but it's more like a, hey, this exists, check it out. So field sizing landed in Chromium, and it solves this very particular problem where you have an input that people can type into, but you want that input to be as wide or as high as the content inside of it. Now, solving this with JavaScript requires duplicating the content, keeping track of it somewhere else, measuring that, or doing some hacky bits with CSS Grid. And that's not great to work with, because trust me, I've tried all of that. Field sizing just works. It's much nicer to do. And hopefully it'll land in other browsers soon. So who here has ever implemented their own select? I see some hands going like this, and you're right. You should be a little hesitant because each and every one of you did a terrible job. But it's not your fault, because implementing a select is a lot of work. There is a lot of stuff that the browser does for you that is very hard to replicate. But a regular select is also kind of garbage, because you can't do anything with it. It's very unstylable, you can't even put icons in it, so you have to make a choice. Enter select list. Select list is an element that's in development that essentially re-implements a select, but makes every single part of your select individually stylable, like regular HTML elements. So, for example, if I want my drop-down to be grid-based, yeah, no problem. Now it's grid-based. But the browser takes care of all the accessibility. So I can use my keyboard. If I start typing, it'll select the element that I typed, etc., etc. So this is going to change a lot. It used to be called select menu, now it's called select list. Currently they're thinking of re-implementing select as this and having a sort of opt-in into it. So everything I'm showing here is going to change, but know that a stylable select is coming and it's going to be great. Now, lastly, just a really cool demo. So doing any parallax on a page is really cool, and there are some very nice JavaScript browser or JavaScript frameworks that help you do that, like GreenSock. But there's a new spec called scroll-driven animations that let you control the animation of any element based on the scroll position of any other element on the page. And that allows you to do stuff like this, where all of this is purely declarative CSS. As you scroll, each of these elements listens to the scroll position and adds some CSS, adds some transform, etc. So right now it's available just in Chromium, but you can go to scroll-driven-animations.style for cool demos and more information. So those are things you can do in modern browsers today, and things you will be able to do in modern browsers without needing JavaScript. And you can use CSS and HTML to manage them and let the browser do all the hard work for you. So I hope you now love CSS and HTML too. Thanks.